For decades, the narrative of World War II has been monopolized by the victors. We've heard speeches about military tactics, famous commanders, maps, and impersonal statistics. But this video is not about any of that. You will find no heroic speeches or ideological justifications here. Instead, you will hear the stifled voices of those consumed by fear, shame, or death itself. Voices of German soldiers who walked through hell on earth. Men who fought on the frozen, blood-soaked Eastern Front. Some survived. Others vanished into the snow and flames, while many more were marked forever. These testimonies do not seek to forgive or to condemn. They simply aim to reveal what truly happened during the war, what should never have happened, and what, if forgotten, could happen again. First testimony. Heinrich Krüger, the Siege of Stalingrad. Heinrich Krüger was 23 years old when he was sent to Stalingrad as a corporal in the 6th Panzer Division of the German 6th Army. In January 1943, he found himself trapped with the survivors of his unit in the southern sector of the city, near the old tractor factory. Soviet forces had completed the encirclement, and the temperature had dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. There were no more supply routes, ammunition was scarce, and evacuation was impossible. Krüger remained for more than 3 weeks in a destroyed building with other soldiers before being captured. This is his testimony. I never imagined that cold could inflict more suffering than a bullet, but in Stalingrad I learned that it could. The cold destroys you from the inside. It tears your skin, devours your bones, and paralyzes your thoughts. We took shelter in the basement of a ruined factory, surrounded by twisted beams and frozen bricks. At first, there were 7 of us, then fewer. Eventually, we stopped counting. We couldn't tell a Tuesday from a Sunday, or whether 3 days or 10 had passed. The only certainty was that no one was coming to save us, and the Russians were drawing closer. Our supplies ran out during the first week. Then came the darkest despair. Someone caught a rat, and we cooked it over rotting wood. The smell attracted other soldiers from the next building. We fought over the bones. I never thought I would beg for a gnawed bone, and yet I did. Crying, I knelt down to get a fragment of burnt cartilage. We slept pressed against one another, not out of affection, but necessity. Body heat was the only source of life. One of us, Miller, didn't wake up one morning. We left him in a corner. A few hours later, he was stiff as a board. We had to take his coat. It was dry. Mine was soaked with urine and blood. The toes on my feet turned black. The fingers on my left hand began to fall off. My thumb detached just by brushing against the rifle barrel. I didn't scream. I just stared at the piece of flesh on the floor and felt shame. Shame for still being alive, for breathing while others froze beside me. At night, we heard screams, some in German, some in Russian, sometimes orders, sometimes prayers, sometimes just meaningless cries. In the barracks, Klaus kept hallucinating that his mother was waiting outside with a bowl of hot soup. He went out without boots. He died in the snow. We found him the next day, his face eaten by rats. We said nothing. We only tried to close his eyes. They were frozen open. The last thing I ate that resembled meat was when we roasted an old boot. We tore off the sole, scraped the leather, and boiled it in a helmet filled with melted snow. It tasted like smoke and metal. One man vomited blood. Another had diarrhea and died of dehydration. We didn't even try to bury him. We no longer had the strength to dig. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. The days without bombardment were the worst. It meant they were close. They moved among the ruins. We heard footsteps, breathing, and every shadow could hide an ambush. Some soldiers slept with a grenade on their chest, the pin half pulled. One accidentally blew his torso apart. We found only his legs. No one cried. We just sat in a circle, inhaling his smoke, his blood, his end. I thought about surrendering, but there was no one to surrender to. If you went outside, they killed you. If you stayed, you died. It was just a matter of choosing how. They amputated 3 of my fingers without anesthesia. They tied a rope around my arm, heated a blade, and cut. The infection kept spreading. The doctor had died the week before. All that remained was a nurse, a manual, and trembling hands. After the amputation, I lost consciousness. I don't know how long I was out. When I woke up, someone had shoved a rag in my mouth to keep me from biting my tongue. When the Soviets finally arrived, I felt no fear, only relief. I surrendered without looking at their faces. I knelt and showed my hands. They said nothing. They simply removed my helmet and dragged me outside. I hadn't seen sunlight in days. My eyes burned. I survived. I don't know why. I don't know for what reason. At night, I still hear the screams, the wind seeping through shattered walls, the sound of bones beneath boots. What happened in Stalingrad wasn't a battle. It was a silent slaughterhouse, a white butcher's yard, and I was, unfortunately, a witness. Second testimony. Kurt Eisenhardt trapped in Kharkov. Kurt Eisenhardt was 31 and held the rank of sergeant in the 5th Panzer Division of the Waffen-SS, known as Viking, when he fought near the city of Kharkov, Ukraine, during the winter of 1943. In the midst of a partial retreat following the disaster at Stalingrad, German forces were struggling to reorganize under extreme conditions. Eisenhardt was one of the few survivors of his company, which was cut off for 5 days on the outskirts of the city. This testimony was recovered from a medical report written after his hospitalization in Dnipro, where he was treated for severe frostbite and neurological trauma. They told us we would take up positions outside Kharkov, that it would be a quick maneuver to contain the Soviets and then retreat in order. It was a lie. It was a trap. We entered a half-destroyed industrial district. Empty warehouses, smoke rising from the ground. The enemy was already there. It wasn't a staging area. It was a slaughterhouse. There were 23 of us. In the end, 5 remained. 5 shadows. I don't know how long we were trapped within those walls. It could have been 5 days or 5 weeks. Time dissolved into snow, hunger, and fear. We lost contact with command on the 2nd day. The radio froze. The batteries died. Just like us. The cold was worse than the enemy. I don't say that to be dramatic. It's literal. The cold killed us slowly from within. The fingers began to hurt. Then they went numb. Then they vanished. To the touch, they were simply gone. One of the men broke his teeth trying to warm himself with his rifle barrel. He held it in his mouth like a pipe. The metal ripped the skin from his lips. We hid in a collapsed warehouse. There were corpses in the corners, covered with snow as if they were sleeping. We didn't know if they were ours or theirs. It didn't matter anymore. One of them had intact boots. I traded them for mine. Mine were rotting. When I took them off, I saw that the foot was still inside. I threw it away without thinking. Then I vomited. But I kept the boots. We had some black bread, frozen solid. We cut it with bayonets. Every bite was like glass in the mouth. On the 3rd day, someone suggested eating the dead horse we'd seen in the alley behind us. And so we did. We dragged the body to a makeshift fire. The meat was green. We cooked it anyway. It tasted of gasoline. We all got sick. One man died the next day. We never knew if it was the meat or something else. The gunfire was constant, distant, above our heads, against the walls. No one slept. You closed your eyes and heard footsteps, whispers, screams. They called our names, or so we thought. It was as if the wind itself knew who we were. I stuffed rags into my ears. It didn't help. One day, a sniper pinned us in a corridor. He shot at anything that moved. No one dared to cross for hours. One of us tried to run. He lost his jaw, fell to his knees, and writhed in silence. No tongue. His throat bled like a torn pipe. We dragged him back and shot him out of mercy. I still dream of him every night. The worst moment was when we realized no one was coming, that the high command didn't even know where we were. We had ceased to exist. We decided to attempt an escape at night. We ran through empty streets, under snow and bullets. I saw one of my comrades slip and crack his skull on the pavement. We didn't stop. If you stopped, you died. When we finally reached a German position, they didn't recognize us. They aimed their rifles. We looked like animals, filthy, thin, hollow-eyed. A doctor examined me and said I had early-stage gangrene in both feet. I laughed. I told him it was the best news I'd had in weeks. I never went back to the front. They gave me a medical discharge. Some said I was lucky. I can't begin to describe how absurd that word sounds. I lost my fingers, my voice, my sleep, my face. When I look in the mirror, I don't see Kurt. I see a ghost. One who still hears footsteps in the snow and the echo of his name among the ruins of Kharkov. Third testimony, Eric Weber, the Hell of the Caucasus. Eric Weber was 29 years old. He was a captain in the 3rd Mountain Division, deployed as part of Army Group A during Operation Fall Blau. In December 1942, his unit became trapped in high-altitude positions in the Caucasus Mountains, with no possibility of retreat or reinforcements. Isolated, surrounded by Soviet forces, and facing temperatures below 30 degrees Celsius, Weber's men endured conditions that pushed them beyond the limits of human endurance. His testimony was recovered from a notebook found months later in an abandoned cabin. The wind in the Caucasus doesn't whistle, it screams. It strikes your chest like a spear and seeps through the seams of your coat, through your ears, through your eyes. There is no shelter. You can be inside a cabin, buried under blankets, and still feel your soul freezing. I didn't know what true cold was until I arrived there. There were over 200 of us when we climbed to our position. A week later, less than half remained. The snow never stopped. The sky was gray, still opaque. It felt as if time itself had frozen just to watch us fall apart. We didn't move. We didn't attack. We just waited. Sometimes we fired into the air, just to remind ourselves we were still alive. The Russians were below us. We knew that. But they didn't climb. They didn't need to. The cold would do their work for them. Supplies froze before we could distribute them. Canned food exploded in our pockets. Bread shattered like stone. Water became a memory. We melted snow with candles, with the body heat of the men still breathing. Vogel slept on top of me every night. It was the only way to stay warm. One morning he didn't wake up. His body was stiff, fused to mine. It took hours to separate us. It tore the skin off my arm. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My lips were cracked, crusted with dry blood. When I tried to speak, I spat ice. We began burning everything. Empty ammunition crates, shovel handles, broken rifle stocks, then books, then photographs, even portraits of our families. Someone burned a wooden cross. Another man struck him, called it blasphemy. They fought. No one stopped them. It was better to feel anger than fear. Some men began to lose their minds. One of ours, a young Bavarian, said he could hear music in the rocks. He took off his gloves, started dancing, laughing. He died naked, fingers black, eyes staring up at the sky. We covered him with a coat and kept sitting around the fire as if nothing had happened. Orders stopped coming. The radio broke. Our sergeant major went out to look for help. He never returned. We found his body a week later, torn apart by wolves or something else. We'll never know. His legs were gone, his face gnawed away. It looked as though the mountain itself had devoured him. We ate leather, scraped helmet straps, boiled pieces of belt with dirty snow. One man claimed he'd seen a fox. We followed it. It was an illusion. There was nothing. When we came back, one of us was dead. We formed a circle around him. Someone asked if we should. He didn't finish the sentence. Silence answered for everyone. It wasn't me, at least not with my own hands. But I ate what they gave me. I didn't ask what it was. I just chewed, eyes closed. I still don't know if it was human flesh, but deep down I do. The previous captain shot himself. He left a note. "I'm sorry I can't bring you home." We buried him with it. It was the only grave we dug during all those weeks. The others we threw into the ravine. The ground was too hard. I remember one dawn in particular. The sky turned red. I thought it was a sign that hell had come for us. I laughed. I was alone, covered in frost, my eyelids frozen so stiff I couldn't blink. I heard voices. I don't know if they were real. After that, I lost consciousness. Fourth testimony. Matthias Brenner. The Massacre of Kerch. Matthias Brenner was 24 years old. He was a private in the 132nd German Infantry Division, deployed on the Kerch Peninsula in eastern Crimea during the final offensive against entrenched Soviet forces in the area. In May 1942, his unit was engaged in extremely violent combat, frontal assaults against heavily defended Soviet trenches. The fighting was house to house, hill to hill, and ended in a massacre. Matthias survived, but what he experienced stayed with him forever. His testimony was recorded years later during an archival interview conducted by military physicians specializing in post-traumatic stress. I had never used a bayonet before Kerch. They trained me to shoot, to throw grenades, to follow orders, but no one ever taught me what it meant to look a man in the eyes while stabbing him again and again until he stopped moving. I learned that at Kerch the hard way, up close with no room for hesitation. They ordered us to capture a line of Soviet trenches on Hill 174. They told us it was strategic. What they didn't say was that it was mined, filled with machine gun nests, and that the Russians had no intention of giving up an inch. We moved at dawn through thick fog and soaked boots. There were more than 100 of us. By nightfall, maybe 30 were still standing, and that's being generous. We crossed open ground with no cover. Bullets whistled past us like whispers of death. Every explosion threw soil, blood, and scraps of uniform into the air. We screamed, but no one could hear. Only the crunch of bones, the thunder of mortars, the howling of the wounded. One of ours was torn in half by a mine. His torso twisted as if trying to crawl away from itself. We covered him with a blanket and kept moving. When we reached the first enemy trench, it was filled with bodies, some dead, others not. A Russian pointed a pistol at me while throwing dirt in my face. I shot him. I don't remember deciding to do it. I just did. He fell beside me, staring. His blood splattered across my face. I didn't wipe it off. I couldn't move. The fighting was hand to hand. Fists, rifle butts, knives, bayonets. No time to think, only to survive. I saw a comrade drive his blade into a man's neck while sobbing. Then he fell to his knees and vomited. Another shot a fleeing Russian in the back. When I asked him why, he said. Better him than me. Blood was everywhere. On our clothes, on our hands, in the soil. The ground was so soaked that the corpses didn't sink. They floated. And through it all, the screams. Men burning, men calling for their mothers, men cursing God. There is no sound more terrible than someone dying slowly, lungs full of dirt. A Soviet officer had barricaded himself inside a stone house. We threw in 2 grenades and went in. 3 were still alive. 1 was on fire. Another kept shooting without arms. The 3rd begged us to kill him. No one moved. I shot him, not out of mercy, but because I couldn't bear his voice any longer. After the battle, the cleanup was the worst part. Collecting remains, dragging out the wounded, identifying the dead. There were so many that we started numbering them with chalk on their foreheads. Sometimes, not even that. We dug mass graves and threw them in like sacks. Some were still breathing. One grabbed my arm as we buried him. I didn't say a word. I kept digging. We covered him anyway. That night, I slept on a corpse. Not by choice. It was the only dry spot. I wrapped it in a blanket and lay on top. It smelled of dried blood, urine, and gunpowder. It smelled like war. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it all again. Bayonets, wide eyes, exposed entrails. They sent me to a field hospital with fever and sores on my feet. The doctor asked me what had happened. I told him I didn't remember. I lied. I remembered everything. I still remember everything. Kerch wasn't a battle. It was a slaughterhouse with the name of a city, a pit where we buried not just bodies, but whatever humanity we had left. After that, I was no longer a soldier. I was something else. Something that could kill without looking. 5th testimony. Ernst Naumann, the mechanized hell of Kursk. Ernst Naumann was 31 years old. He was a platoon commander in the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, deployed during Operation Citadel across the burning fields of Kursk. A veteran of the Eastern Front, he had fought in Ukraine and Kharkov, and now faced what many would later call the Great Meat Grinder, the largest tank battle of the entire war. His testimony, recorded in the 1960s, was recovered from the archives of a military sanatorium where Naumann had been admitted due to severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He never set foot in a city again. Kursk wasn't a battle. It was a corpse factory. The orders were clear: advance at any cost. But the cost was so high that at times we had to walk over our own dead. The earth split open with every explosion. And the German tanks, those steel beasts that once seemed invincible, turned into moving ovens. On the first day, we advanced under a brutal sun. The dust clung to our skin like a second layer. Amid the roar of engines, we could hear the relentless pounding of Soviet artillery. They had guns everywhere, on every hill, in every trench, around every bend. They knew we were coming. They were waiting, teeth bared. I saw the first Tiger tank explode after just 20 minutes, not from a cannon, but from a mine. The ground was littered with them, one after another. The engineers couldn't keep up. Some detonated while the men inside were still whole, but without heads. A clean, silent explosion. Sometimes the tank kept rolling for a few meters, with no one alive inside. We advanced through flames and shrapnel. The heat was unbearable, not only from the weather, but from the fires. The wheat fields caught easily. The vehicles that were hit turned into torches. Sometimes the crews jumped out already on fire, running blindly. One of them leapt into a ditch filled with spilled fuel. He screamed until his throat melted. Another tore off his burning jacket and collapsed. His eyes burst from the heat. There was no safe place. Russian machine guns fired from hidden bunkers. Their snipers were patient as snakes. A single bullet was enough to make you bleed to death. But the true horror came from below. The Soviet trenches were connected by tunnels. They emerged behind us at night, slitting the throats of our sentries. One morning we found 3 of our men with their mouths full of dirt and their genitals cut off, hanging on the barbed wire as a warning. The order was clear: no retreat, never retreat. One platoon was wiped out, and we were forbidden to recover the wounded. They were declared expendable. We passed by their bodies for 3 days. The stench was unbearable. The sun bloated them like balloons. Flies covered their faces. One had his eyelids torn off. Another's jaw was split in 2, hanging like a wet rag. One day I fired at a group of Soviet soldiers running toward us. When the smoke cleared, I saw they were adolescents, some barely more than children. One had a photograph hanging around his neck. I picked it up. It was his mother, smiling. I had a mother too, but that day I stopped thinking about her. It was easier to kill when you forgot where you came from. The mud was another enemy, so dense it swallowed boots and entire vehicles. A Panzer IV got stuck, and the Soviets burned it alive with Molotov cocktails. There were no gunshots, only fire. We heard pounding from inside. They were beating on the tank walls as if they could break free by force, but no one made it out. The sky was black with smoke. The trees were burning. The ground trembled day and night. We didn't know if it was the earth shaking or if we were breaking apart inside. Some men began laughing in the middle of combat. Empty laughter, meaningless. One of my men took off his helmet and shouted at the sky, "Come and get me, damn you!" A bullet tore through his forehead. He dropped to his knees, then fell backward. His eyes stayed open, as if still waiting for an answer. There were soldiers who carried pieces of others with them. A finger, an ear, a tooth. Macabre talismans. I never did, but I understood the impulse. It was a way of saying, I survived. But surviving Kursk wasn't living. It was crawling among the dead, pretending to be human. At the end of the offensive, when we learned the operation had failed, we just looked at each other in silence. Not because of the defeat, but because there was nothing left inside us. We were empty machines covered in blood, ours and theirs. We had gone east to conquer. The few of us who returned came back as walking corpses. I haven't slept since. Every time I close my eyes, Kursk calls me. It shows me the flames, the screams, the mud filled with bones. And I answer, because a part of me is still there, buried with those who never came back. It was men like Hinrich, Kurt, Erich, Matthias, and Ernst who gave a human face to a war that over time has become nothing more than numbers, maps, and empty dates in history books. Their testimonies are not pleas for redemption or heroism. They are not calls for pride or for oblivion. They are screams that survived the thunder, echoes of souls who lived too much and died inside long before the fighting stopped. Today, decades later, their voices still burn. They remind us that behind every uniform, there was a trembling body, a fractured mind, a broken conscience. That the enemy was not always in front of them. Sometimes it was within. And perhaps that is the most terrifying part. This video is a warning, because war does not end when the cannons fall silent. It ends when we finally listen to those who were never able to forget.